Good. So we're recording now. Um, Hopefully everyone can see on their screens the Jesus in Psalm 31 opening slide. And this is the last psalm that we're going to be doing because as I'm almost in that place now, as I was just saying, of handing over the text for Jesus in the Psalms, I'm starting to kind of work now on Jesus in Exodus, or what we're calling Jesus in the Great Escape. So after Christmas, we'll use these kind of Old Testament sessions. We'll actually start looking at kind of key chunks and sections of the book of Exodus and how Jesus is revealed in those. So that I was going to say that should be fun. I think Bible study is fun, but I know that not everyone kind of goes down the same route. But Psalm 31 is a fantastic way of finishing. I was thinking I couldn't have planned it better. I didn't actually plan it at all. I just kind of pulled them out randomly. But actually, when it came to thinking about it, Psalm 31 is such a great place to finish looking at these Psalms. In the book that's just about to kind of come out, Psalm 31 sits right next to Psalm 32. It's because I've kind of grouped Psalms thematically. And so not Psalm 32, Psalm 22. Psalm 22, of course, is the first psalm that Jesus quotes from the cross. And then we come here to Psalm 31, and Psalm 31 is the second psalm that Jesus quotes from the cross. So he makes 7 statements from the cross. Some of them are to do to people, like to his mother. Take your mother now to John, and so on, and some to the criminals who crucified with him, and so on. Some about being thirsty, the fantastic statement about forgiving them, they don't know what they do. But there are these 2 quotes from the book of Psalms which are fantastic, and I cover them as formative prophecies. Not formative, sorry, ecstatic prophecies. They are prophecies whereby, in the context of worship, and I think this is this is part of the experience of the Christian faith. We have it today, but in a slightly different way for what it'd be like for Jesus. But it's almost as if the worshippers come along and they're in that place of worship or deep engagement with the Lord, sometimes out of anxiety and pain, and in that place of anxiety is their spirit somehow touches on to the spirit that communicates the heart of the Godhead into creation, and God's word comes through his spirit into their spirits. And so something of the cross, Jesus's passion, kind of resonates or touches with theirs. And although in one sense they are triggered by their own experience and their own environment, so we find contexts that aren't to do with Jesus but are to do with the psalm writer, for David for instance, kind of written into the psalm, what you suddenly find is these elements that make it very resonant of the cross, and Psalm 31 is one of those. And more than that, of course, it's one like that, so it happens. It's something that Jesus quotes from the cross, which also probably means he is looking to communicate something by giving us the quote. Psalm 22, as we looked at earlier, communicates a whole load of things, but Psalm 31, in many ways, I think tells us something a little bit deeper than Psalm 22. Psalm 31, well, I'll tell you what you'll do is start working kind of through the slides. So I remind myself how we did this. With these evening sessions, I kind of I tend to pull the slides together quite quickly and then I forget about them. So it reminds me as I go through what I've written. So here you go. It's quoted from the cross. So on the cross, Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, says, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And having said this, he breathed his last. So that's Luke's version of Jesus's last words. John gives us slightly different words. In John, it says, "It is finished." But actually, if you actually look up in John, it says, "It is finished," and he gave up his spirit. It's kind of almost implicit in John that there's the extra little bit, which we read here in Luke. But for John, with his kind of theological perspective, he wants to get across the completeness of what Jesus has done. So it's finished, and then he gives up his spirit. Whereas actually we have the giving up of Jesus' spirit recorded for us in the book of Luke. So it's Jesus' famous last words, if we can think of it like that. So there's a kind of a structure before we get there. That quote comes from verse 5. So we're going to read through the whole of the psalm tonight, because it's part of the pleasure of having that length of time to be able to do it. But in the kind of the run up to verse 5, there's a kind of a little sort of mini structure if you just want to kind of notice it in the psalm. I was going to show you in a minute. It's on the next slide, so don't worry too much. There's a kind of an affirmation at the beginning of dependence by Jesus, and then there's a kind of a request, and then there's a kind of an affirmation now of faith and dependence. And that's it's a very kind of ancient world, Aramaic world way of thinking. It's kind of like we bookend the main request with that kind of a very kind of similar statement of the fact I'm totally dependent on you, Lord. So I'm so dependent on you, Lord. I'm going to make my requests now because I'm so dependent on you, and I'm going to remind you that I'm so dependent. And here's my statement of faith. And that's the kind of, there's a wrapping up of the kind of a certain level of prayer just in these opening verses. So it starts the whole psalm in verse 1. Here's the first of those kind of statements of dependence. Well, it starts obviously with it for the chief musician, and it's a psalm of David. I put there in brackets a psalm of the beloved. There are precisely half of all the psalms, I think I may have said this before, are attributed to David. 73 out of the 150 actually have his name. They're ascribed like this: a psalm of David, and then there are 2 psalms that the New Testament ascribes to David which don't have his name in them, so it adds up to 75. But it doesn't necessarily mean that David wrote every single one of them. I think I've said that before. But it probably means that they are psalms that belong to the tabernacle of David. So he does write some of them quite clearly, but it's possible that some of them are more generally, they are part of the worship that David has instigated. But in this one, so it's a psalm of David, and David's name of course means beloved, and Jesus becomes the beloved son. So there's something of which this whole psalm is of him, it's for him, it kind of captures him. And then it makes this positive statement of dependence. In you, Yahweh, I take refuge. I'm dependent in you. You are my strength. You are my refuge. It's that kind of statement. And then he starts the prayer. So it kind of moves on to the request. Let me never be disappointed. So that's part of the prayer. Deliver me in your righteousness. And the prayer kind of goes on, verse 2. And bow down your ear to me. So in other words, listen to me. Deliver me speedily. Be to me a strong rock, a house of defence to save me. Because you're my rock and you're my fortress, so for your name's sake, lead me and guide me. Pluck me out of the net which they've laid secretly for me, for you are my stronghold. And this is a very relevant kind of prayer for the cross, as we're going to see. Jesus links it in. It's kind of by quoting from the cross, Jesus knows every word of this, and quite an awful lot of his listeners will know every word of this psalm as well. In the effort of having to lift up his weight so that he can exhale and say something, Jesus gives us a quote from here. He wants us to know that there's a kind of sense in which this is part of his prayer. By saying, into your hands I commit my spirit, he's telling us that he's been praying like this, that the Lord will bow down and deliver him speedily, be his strong rock, a defence and saving me, my rock and my fortress, and for your name's sake you lead me and guide me, and pluck me out of the net that they've laid secretly for me, which of course is what's happened as Jesus has gone into the crucifixion. And then it comes, and into your hand I commend my spirit. I've got the wrong word. I think I should have I've highlighted the word my. It should be highlighted the word red. Redeem me, Yahweh, God of truth. You'll see why in a minute. So it should be me that's highlighted in red rather than my. And I hate those who regard lying vanities, but I trust in Yahweh. They're both kind of part of his. One is a statement of faith in action. So I'm going to do something now that is by faith. I've said you my refuge, I've said you my rock, so I'm commending my spirit to you. You see that? One is an affirmation of faith, one is I'm now going to do this in faith. And then he affirms again, I trust in you, Yahweh. So that's there. But let's come back to that little word that should be highlighted in red, the me. Oh, there you go. On this page I've highlighted the correct one. So into your hand I commend my spirit. It goes on, redeem me, Yahweh, God of truth. And in this kind of context, that little word me, it's interesting because it's the way it's actually written. It's that little word which some of you will know if you've read the book so far. It's the word auth. It's not the at, it's the auth. And the auth is a word that is always used for the mark or the sign of God's covenant. It's the thing he's kind of doing. But it's actually been extended by a little yod. The yod is that little tiny kind of looks like a comma. Or at the top, not comma, kind of what's the apostrophe. It looks like an apostrophe, the yod. So it's an althi. It's not just an alth, it's althi. Because the apostrophe, that was not the apostrophe. The yod, if you extend a word like that in Hebrew, it's basically a standard kind of way of showing that a noun belongs to someone. In fact, it belongs to a me. So my son, remember when God says over Jesus, this is my son, if you go and look in the Psalm, it says Ben, which is the word for son, Ben-E, so it's Ben-E. So Alf-E is my sign. This is my sign, but we don't show it as my sign or my mark. It could be. I think Young's literal translation of the Bible actually has, I've got, and there, you've got my token. Young's uses the phrase token, because an Alf, it could even be like kind of cutting your X, put your mark here, sign on the dotted line, put your signature. It's a kind of an authentication of something, and it's very often it goes with a kind of a covenantal or a contractual kind of binding agreement. So you put your mark on it, you put your sign on it. And so the Alf was, for instance, the sign of circumcision. That was God's mark on Abraham and all of his offspring, that they carried it with them. It was engraved into them. They carried the sign of the covenant. And so that's the word that is in there, but we just translate it as me. Put it that way. Oh dear, that's a shame. It says the Paleo Hebrew pictogram for the letter Yod is an arm and a hand, and if it was showing me the right font, which I actually have used in the presentation, but I think because I'm doing this via the web, it's changed the font. So you've just got a Y. Actually, in the kind of the Paleo Hebrew, particularly if you've got the Jesus in the beginning, Jesus in the Old Testament, you can go and look it up in there. It's actually an arm with a hand on it, and it actually becomes a Y if you kind of turn it up on its side. So you have to kind of look that one up for yourself. But that Paleo Hebrew pictogram unfortunately hasn't come out. So it's actually the Yod is a hand on an arm, and you can understand the logic. So if Ben is my son, if Alf is a sign, and then I add that hand and arm to it, it becomes something that's in my hand. It belongs to me. So that you see the logic of it. So the Ben, but he's in my hand. He belongs to me. The Alf, but he's in my hand. So it's literally kind of sign of me, my token, or it's the mark in my hand. All of those are kind of a very valid and totally legitimate ways of understanding that little word Alf-E. It's the Alf, the sign, the mark that's in my hand. Is that all making sense? Sorry, perhaps overstating a little bit. So in that kind of sense, it's totally legitimate when you're looking at verse 5 to kind of think of it in terms like, you have redeemed my token, faithful Yahweh Elohim. So, well, what's my token? Well, a token is something that normally buys something, isn't it? You've got the token, you can redeem it. I go and get the thing it's there for. So it's been redeemed. Or the mark in my hand, which I quite like, because obviously it talks of the nails and crucifixion. But even that little word Alf, which was made up of the Aleph, the bull's head, which is the biggest thing you could sacrifice, Wav, which was a nail or a peg or a hook, so you fix it on something, and the Tav, which was a cross. You have redeemed my biggest sacrifice, nailed or fixed to a cross, faithful Yahweh. There's a kind of a sense in which if you look at the multiple layers of meaning within that tiny little word, you get so many aspects or nuances of the cross in that phrase. And now, obviously, well, I say obviously, I think about these things, you think, so does Jesus know that? Is that true? Is it not true? Have I just read in what I shouldn't read in? But it wasn't a difficult read in, if I could put it that way. It wasn't hard. Once you know the things you're looking at, once you know the symbols, you kind of look at it and go, oh yeah, oh yeah. And so here's the question. I don't know, I doubt, in fact, I probably doubt that when Jesus said those words from the cross, he was thinking of all of those things. But when he said them, he was probably responding in spirit, and the Father who commissioned those words that were inspired by the Holy Spirit, that were written by David 1,000 years before the cross happened, the Father was absolutely knew the possibility that idiots like me would come along and read all of this into it. Sorry, you get what I'm saying. He must have known that. And if he knew it, then actually that's still interesting. He knew that this would have an impact on me, if I can put it that way. And it does. And I think to myself, wow, isn't that amazing? I don't know what your response is seeing those things, but I love seeing these things. And for me, it becomes, and Psalms is such a good book to do this with anyway. It's a book to meditate on, and this becomes part of the way we meditate on it. So we see these layers of meaning. So that's verse 5. But it's not the end of what's interesting about this psalm. So we've had a statement of faith, the request, statement of dependent faith, and the into my hands I commit my spirit, quoted from the cross. and you have redeemed this mark that's in my hand, this experience of the cross, my big sacrifice on the cross, this token of salvation, this token of whatever, you've redeemed it. You've done something with it. It means something. It's bigger than just itself. So then the kind of the next verses, we actually start to get something of Jesus' inner attitude. So he says, I'll be glad and I'll rejoice in your loving kindness. So now this is a kind of statement of faith, because it's not what Jesus is experiencing in one sense, but I will be glad and rejoice in your loving kindness, for you have seen my affliction and you have known my soul in adversities. You know me in my adversities. And that little phrase, you've known my soul, actually, pain and the suffering of life has become part of the experience of God. It's not that he knows about it. It's a bit like if you're a blind person, so let's say you're a blind computer, put it that way, and as a blind computer you are told everything there is to know about the colour blue. But the question is, you've never experienced blue. And so, if you like, there is a sense in which God knows everything there is to know about human suffering, except he's never actually experienced it. And the only way he does is he takes on humanity, and he comes in. So you've known my soul in adversities, because the soul of Jesus actually goes back to the Father. It's part of what he's commissioning back. He takes by experience what it means to see the colour blue, what it is to feel human suffering. And of course Hebrews makes a big theological issue of this, that changes our priest, it changes our intercessor. Job challenges God with the thing of, what right do you have to condemn us when you don't know what it's like? Would that there was someone who could take hold of God and take hold of man and bring the two together, and Jesus becomes that. And part of that is because his soul knows adversity. He knows what this feels like. And you've not shut me up into the hand of my enemy. I love that. It's not into the hand of my enemy, because actually this mark that is in my hand, my mark, my sign, the hand that is in my hand, is not in the hand of my enemy. You've set my feet in a large place. And I think there's somewhere in the psalm, but I can't spot it right now. It refers to being into God's hands, into your hand. Well, into your hands I commit your spirit. Sorry. So, pretty darn obvious, isn't it? Into God's hands he commits his spirit. So into your hands I put the spirit that is in my hand. And going back to that one, you've not shut me up into the hand of the enemy. See all that kind of that language that's kind of multi-layering there. So have mercy on me, Yahweh, because I'm in distress, he says. So you can imagine this as part of the prayer and part of the inner dialogue of Jesus on the cross. My eye and my soul and my body have wasted away with grief. My life is spent with sorrow, my years with sighing. Now my strength fails because of my sin. Okay, it's not necessarily Jesus' sin here, but that's part of the thing with ecstatic prophecies. So they are being written out of David's experience, but somehow capturing something that goes beyond it. My bones are wasted away. Because of all my adversaries, I become utterly contemptible to my neighbours, fear to my acquaintances. Oh, it's interesting, isn't it? Because actually all of Jesus' main close friends have gone at the moment. John is there, but where are the other 11? They're not there. Those who saw me in the street fled from me. And I'm forgotten. So those that saw Jesus as he came in to Jerusalem earlier in the week and bowed down, and they put palm leaves down and said, Hosanna who comes in the name of the Lord. Where were they? Where are they now? When he needed those to shout for him, but they weren't there. Now there are reasons for that. The time of the morning, people didn't know what was going on, but it's still, you still feel the lack. Why couldn't they be there for me? I'm forgotten from their hearts like a dead man. I'm like broken pottery. Because I've heard the slander of many and terror on every side. While they conspire against me, they plot to take away my life. And that they conspire together against me, they plot to take away my life, is picked up by Matthew. The beginning of it, they took counsel together. If you remember right back when we started this whole process with the Psalms, we started in Psalm 2. Why did the nations take counsel together? We had that same phrase, against me, and against the Messiah. So there they are taking counsel against the Messiah. And Matthew quotes that already. He quotes that, I think, in chapter 22. Here in chapter 26, he takes it and expands it. Now it fits better with Psalm 31. So he said they took counsel together that they might take Jesus by deceit and kill him. So he's just paralleling the prophetic principle that's now kind of being expanded in Psalm 31, even though it started in Psalm 2, that they're taking counsel, they're conspiring together, but now they're taking counsel, they're sparring together so that they can kill him. But I trust in you, Yahweh. You are my God. My times are in your hand. Deliver me from the hand of my enemies and from those who persecute me. Make your face shine on your servant. Save me in your loving kindness. Let me not be disappointed, Yahweh, for I've called on you. Let the wicked be disappointed. Let them be silent in Sheol. In other words, yeah. So let them eat their own words, I suppose is the way he's saying. Let the lying lips be mute, which speak against the righteous insolently with pride and contempt. I have to confess, on one occasion, I was in a bit difficult situation where someone got me into big trouble. It was in my secular work, because they lied about me. I can remember going off being absolutely devastated and furious and really angry. And I was kind of praying, asking the Lord for something, and I did one of those open your Bible in the middle somewhere, and you end up in the Psalms normally. I actually got this verse, let the lying lips be mute, so I definitely hung on to that one. Yeah, shut that lying mouth up. It's probably not the spirit it was actually prayed in, but that was my experience of this verse. Oh, how great is your goodness, which you've laid upon those who fear you, and which you've worked for those who take refuge in you before the sons of men. So you can see the context is this of in fact, have I missed where's the thing about you put my feet in a broad place? I think it might be coming up. So in the shelter of your presence you'll hide them from the plotting of man. You'll keep them secretly in a dwelling away from strife of tongues. Praise to you, Yahweh. Well, I normally change that to just the YWH8 HW, no, whichever, He has shown me his marvellous loving kindness in a strong city. But as for me, I said in my haste. Now I love this verse. I'm cut down from before your eyes. Nevertheless, you heard the voice of my sincere prayer when I cried to you. So Jesus' kind of question from the cross earlier, which was from Psalm 22. Psalm 22, where he starts with, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is referenced now here in Psalm 31, in verse 22, interestingly. I said in my haste, I'm cut off from before your eyes. My God, why have you forsaken me? Nevertheless, you heard the voice of my sincere prayer when I cried to you. So Jesus' question from the cross was actually a sound in the ears of God of sincere prayer. It's kind of it's the prayer of someone who's passed through despair rather than kind of it's their bitter conclusion. So and that's how he says God hears it. You understood when I cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? This was a sincere prayer. Often you'll see a word, I think the King James has supplications. I can't think of sincere prayer is my word, but if you want to go and look it up, I haven't got the Strong's number there, but you can do this yourself. I'm sure you're capable of doing that. If you want to go and look up, you'll find that the word actually does mean that. It means to kind of bow voluntarily. So that's why it's sincere prayer. Sorry, the root word means to acknowledge or defer voluntarily. It's not because you have to, which is why it's kind of that sincere. It's actually I'm doing, and actually that's a wonderful little truth in its own right, that this prayer isn't something that, if you like, well, because God's God, and at the moment Jesus is human, and therefore he just has to. Actually, Jesus is being outrageously treated, and if you like, it would be within his rights to make a big issue of it. But instead, he's saying, but I'm giving it to you to do. I'm giving it to you to do. This is my sincere prayer for you to sort it out. I'm going to let go of my rights here. I'm not going to take them. This is sincere. It's not because I can't do anything else. It's not because I couldn't be something different, but it is because actually I declare I'm dependent on you. You get the kind of feel. So I really love this verse. I said in my haste, my God, why have you forsaken me? I said in my haste, I'm cut off from before your eyes, but you heard it as my sincere prayer, because I wasn't staying there. I'm passing through. I'm going to get to that place. Here it is. Oh, there you go. I haven't got it. Here it is. Here's the Strong's number. Tatunum. Should have actually practiced saying that before I put it on, isn't it? It's actually translated there as earnest prayer, but if you go and look at the roots of the word, you'll find it's because it's kind of freely given. It's a freely offered prayer, which is why it's supplication. Oh, love Yahweh, all his saints. It's kind of he kind of turns it around now. So Jesus has gone through that moment. So now the challenge is, so to all of us, all of his saints, you and me, love Yahweh. Yahweh preserves the faithful. He fully recompenses those who who behaves arrogantly. In other words, I can sort it. I can do it without you. I'm not dependent on you. I can do it. But be strong and let your heart take courage, all of you who hope in Yahweh. That's how it kind of goes on. And I think, therefore, yeah, it's the end. But as we've got to kind of technically the end of the psalm, I just want to kind of go back because I just find there was that. I said I was looking for something earlier, which I thought was in there. I can't see where it is. And now, as I said it, I can't even remember what I'm looking for. I
think it was verse 8, Chris.
Is it verse 8? Oh, you've set my feet in a large place. Well done. Thank you for spotting that. Yeah, I focused all of that about being in the hand of the enemy, because there's that wonderful contrast there in verse 8. Thanks ever so much, Derek, for spotting that. Here is Jesus actually on the cross, and actually it's the kind of the complete opposite. His feet are pinned to the sides of the upright pillar. And yet he says, you've set my feet in a large place. And there's this kind of wonderful phrase in this kind of middle verses, this inner attitude, these middle verses of the psalm, where Jesus is kind of expressing faith despite the facts, in the face of the facts, if I can put it that way. And there's a kind of a nuanced way in which I think it's the right way to do that. Sometimes we can live in unreality, and I don't believe Jesus is living in unreality. So here he is, praying or quoting a psalm that says, you've set my feet in a wide place, when his own feet are quite literally physically pinned to a pillar. But actually he knows that even as he comes through this is part of God's freedom. It's part of his Father's freedom. So for instance, when I'm feeling unwell, to kind of live in denial about the fact I feel unwell, to say by faith I'm claiming. So when I go around and tell people how are you feeling, I'm fantastic, I'm brilliant. That often feels a bit fake, and it's kind of as I say, it's denial. But actually the reality is, I may be sick even to death, and yet I know that actually, because of what God has done in me and because of my relationship with him, I will live eternally. So the truth of the matter is, I will live for the proportion of my time with God where I will be sick compared to when I will be healthy is so minuscule that somehow I can express that in a way where I know that ultimately I am healthy. Does that make sense? And it's a heart thing rather than a logical thing, It's how do I come into this? So if I'm gonna do this kind of positive proclamation, don't do it in a kind of religious fake way. Do it in a very real way, which is I want to feel the truth. So like what I think is going on here with Jesus. He knows his feet are pinned to the sides of a cross, but he also knows this is a temporary condition. In actual fact, he is going to fill up everything. It doesn't get much wider than filling up everything. So in eternity, if you like, from the perspective of eternity, the truth is far more important than the moment he's caught out in history. Does that make sense? And it's a very, as I say, maybe being overly subtle here, but it just feels to me it's something of how when we kind of encounter things which we need to pray through the despair into that place of faith, is that where what we're affirming is not in that kind of place of easy denial, which just says, I'm not looking, so I'm going to say this is how it all is, but I know it isn't really, but I'm going to say it because it's a magic formula and that will make it work. It's not that. It is actually, I understand where I'm at. In actual fact, the wonderful thing about this psalm is Jesus acknowledges it. I am wasted away. I do grieve over this. I wish it hadn't happened. But you still put me in a wide place. You get the kind of the tension. So I think I really like Psalm 31, which I say it's a nice place to finish. I think it fits wonderfully with Psalm 22. Psalm 22, which actually, if you like, gives you the physiology, the physical side of the cross. My heart is melted like wax within me. I can count all my bones, and etc., etc. I'm thirsty. You know, they gave me no, the vinegar to drink, Psalm 69, I think. That's a different one. But you know what I'm saying? It's the kind of physical side of the cross. Here in Psalm 31, you kind of get, if you like, the inner journey, the inner spirit. You know, that there's that moment in the book of Job where Job's wife says to him, you know, you're going through all this rubbish, why don't you just curse God and die? It's kind of like, do you know what? I thought God was for me, but he's not, so whatever you, and off I go. And Job doesn't, you know, that, and Job in his mini way as a type of Christ is modeling what Jesus goes through. I am in this real circumstance, I am in this place, but it's still the truth that God is my refuge and he will come through for me, and he has done this for me. I will be in a wide place, etc., etc. And he will redeem this sign that is marked, this is mark in my hand, this thing that I have for him. He will do it, he will take it, and he'll make something of it. And it is quite remarkable because obviously as hanging on a tree, everyone who hangs on a tree is a curse, or is under a curse, and this awful kind of implement of torture, which has become a symbol of countless millions of people's freedom, their spiritual freedom. It has been redeemed. Its value has been turned over. It really has. It's fantastic, isn't it? Anyway, I'm getting too excited. Anyway, would anyone like to ask any questions at this point? See who's still here. Oh no, all 5 of you are still here. So anyone would like to ask anything or state anything? No? At least if someone says hello, at least, and at least when we see the recording, people will know there are other people listening. And I wasn't just sitting in my summer house talking at the camera with no one there.
Kristen, one of the earlier verses, I hate those who regard vain idols. It worried me a little bit. I looked up the word hate, but I didn't get any real insight into that. Do you want to comment on it?
Yeah, I think you know, this is partly by saying it's part of the dynamic of the ecstatic prophecy. Oh well, there's a couple of things. First thing is Hebrew is a strange language, and it uses things in a very opposite way to the way we often do in English. So it uses love and hate relativistically quite regularly. Jacob loves Esau, hates Leah, but he still fathers 6 kids with Leah. So you know, I don't know exactly. But what it really means is Hebrew has a way of pushing to the extremes what it's kind of drawing out in nuance. And you find that right the way through scripture, and is kind of well understood. And then the flip side is it often it then does the opposite. So in other words, it uses kind of extremes for what is really relative. So for instance, when Jesus says many are called but few are chosen, what he really means by that is everybody's called and some people get chosen, if you say, or you know, but not many people walk in it. So that the kind of the many is a euphemism for everybody, and so partly it's the way a language uses words. So hating those is a kind of is not this. It's really what the psalmist, and in this context would be David, is expressing is it's kind of in contrast with me, who have made myself totally dependent on just one God. And I'm not looking to kind of hedge my bets by kind of putting it around, doing a bit for Yahweh and a bit for Baal and a bit for here and a bit for there. I'm not like them, and relativistically I'm the total opposite and hate them. That's the kind of the logic. But that's what I mean by the way ecstatic prophecy works, is you find the two interwoven. I think in the book that's coming out, I have a little bit where actually, in fact, you see this in Psalm 22. It's kind of like almost there'll be lines next to each other. One, it's kind of almost as if this is what Jesus is experiencing. The next line is almost like David commenting on what he has just seen, if that makes sense, because that's the nature. It kind of flows in and out and between the experience of the cross and the psalmist's experience. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good question though, Derek, because there are a few bits, particularly in the ecstatic psalms, that you get like that, where you think, oh, that would sound odd in the mouth of Jesus. Well, maybe it's more in the mouth of David, or maybe it's to do with understanding the nature of the way the language is used. It's one of sorry, you've just got me going on a train of thought now, Derek. It's one of the complicated things, which is often difficult. I wouldn't have got it some years back, so I'm not saying this in any kind of snobby way. It's only because of wanting, having a desire to understand more, and you kind of get, and you suddenly see something, which is the rather obvious statement is, they say, most languages don't have easy one-to-one relationships of words, but the trouble is we tend to learn something like French, which is very similar in its roots. It's not that many hundred years different from English, so it feels like we can learn it as, there's a cat, that's le chat, the cat, and it's one-to-one kind of relationships. The more extreme the language gets, like if you want to learn Japanese or Chinese, you find that the fit becomes less and less easy. Because actually words kind of actually describe a kind of an environment that you live in, and if you live in a very different environment, you have different words, and so you're trying to do the same things in similar ways, and particularly in the ancient world, you find, I think there's another of this kind of crossover. So what I'm driving at here is that there's an awful lot of our understanding, and even in things like Strong's dictionary, which is work is being done by various different schools and so on, even Strong's from 100 years or so ago, where we look at it and say, oh well, Strong says this, and actually we shouldn't dismiss that, because it represents incredible amount of scholarship. But the flip side is that we are kind of taking as if what Strong has come up with is a kind of one-to-one equivalent of a word. And a real good example of that is the way in which you find the idea of trembling or fear. Actually, you see, psychologically, this is just interesting. Fear and excitement are chemically very, very close. It's just really, it's your expectation of what comes at the end of it that makes the difference between the two. And actually the Hebrew word you often find is kind of with a tiny little nuance, is leaning one way or the other. So when we read about the wrath of God, it's actually the inner churning of God. And it's far less focused. In English, the word wrath is kind of focused. I express my wrath on this. So I'm looking at a light bulb because it's shining. Expressing my wrath on the light bulb. Whereas in actual fact, it's kind of, I'm feeling this frustration inside. What do I do with that? So I'm feeling, I use the example, if you've heard it, sorry, because it's way back when I was at school, which was a long time ago, of being really frustrated. I was doing some homework. I knew I should be able to see this mathematical equation. I couldn't see it. I got so frustrated that I ended up kind of kicking my maths textbook across the room, because somehow that inner thing has to go somewhere. I didn't really hate my maths textbook, but it had to go somewhere. And I think there's something of that somehow the injustice of the world creates something in God which we sometimes will translate as wrath, but that becomes kind of very much the language of a kind of smitey fate. Sorry, I was trying to make a joke there. Mighty saviour, but smitey saviour kind of thing, because he's going to smite you with his wrath. It's more that it's going to go somewhere, and that's actually what part of the cross is about. Really what I'm driving at is that we don't get the nuance of that kind of, it's much more the inner turmoil that is created in God. We kind of get the sense of everything that's kind of land on me, if I can put it that way. And this things like that, if you like, the shape of the language of translation has very much shaped a lot of our thinking. Now, we shouldn't throw that away, because actually it's a huge amount of scholarship, and unfortunately we live in a day and age where people are inventing new doctrines all the time, and often they use arguments like the one I've just said to kind of totally reinvent something. And I'm not talking about a total reinvention. What I'm trying to say is to understand, to get ourselves into the mindset of the people who were originally using that language and those words, if that makes sense. So that was a rather long aside, Derek, from your question. Anyone else like to ask anything? Oh, we're up to 6 now. Who turned up halfway through? Hi there, Peter. I don't know if you can hear me, but anyway, nice to have you. Nice to have you here. So you'll be able to watch the whole of the thing because it should all be recorded. We're just kind of coming to the end now. Does anyone else want to ask anything? No?
Just a comment, Chris. I noticed in my Bible it says for the word hate, it says it means refuse to be associated with. So it's a bit different, really.
Yeah, well, that's probably drawing at that slightly broader sort of definition of the word.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a generically true statement about ancient Hebrew compared with a modern language, is that all of the words are far broader in their meaning, and therefore are much more reliant on context to kind of help you understand them. So English actually has a huge vocabulary of slightly different words which allow you to pin things down much more precisely. You know, in English we know the difference between moist and damp. So, you know, if your cake is moist, I'm complimenting you. If I say it's damp, you might feel a bit offended. But you don't get that kind of nuance in Hebrew. You kind of got a general word that's used for all things that might be damp, and we have to somehow pick it up from context, if that makes sense. So, but thanks. That's really helpful, Jason. That's really useful.
Okay, thanks.
Good. Well, it's been really... I've really enjoyed this evening, as you perhaps picked up, because I get animated. But if no one else has any other questions, then we'll sign off and say see you after Christmas. Well, no, I think there's one more. There's a New Testament one before Christmas, but otherwise we'll be after Christmas, continuing with the Old Testament. But anyone else like to say anything or ask anything? No. Okay. Well, it's great to have you guys. I'll talk to you again soon.
Great, thanks a lot.
Great. I'm gonna hit record, stop recording, and then we'll hang up. Okay.